The philosopher Roger Scruton said, "Beauty is vanishing from our world because we live as though it did not matter." And up next, we'll be talking with a Catholic artist who is bringing beauty back to the church. Stay tuned.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are your hosts, Sam Guzman and John Heinen. We really appreciate you joining us on another episode. We are excited to talk about beauty. We're excited to talk about art with a professional expert, Robert. But before we get there, if this is your first time listening to us, please click that subscribe button so that you can get each of these episodes as they come out. Sam and I are actively working on a membership program. We are really excited about that. We want to thank all of our patrons and our donors for making that possible. If you are interested in discerning a place to donate, we understand times are tough, so not asking for a ton of money, but if you head over to patreon.com/Catholic Gentleman and give whatever you're capable of giving, we would be incredibly appreciative, and it keeps this ministry going and expanding. So thank you for that. Today, we're joined by Robert Puschautz, who I got to meet at a kind of water to wine, event where my wife and I did a watercolor painting. I will tell you that I came to it with a childish understanding of watercolors. I almost started using my fingers and stuff, but I decided not to. And Robert did such an incredible job. But I would say even directing into the heart of beauty and the heart of what he does, and then his own artistry was just so beautiful and so gorgeous. And so I just immediately thought, we got to have this guy on the episode. Sam and I have talked a lot about trying to find a Catholic artist of his skill and his abilities to join us. And so we are just so blessed to have Robert here today. And I'm going to put a bunch of stuff in the show notes, and he's going to talk about himself later in the episode. But Robert, how are you doing today?
Doing great. So glad to be here with you guys.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And so I just want to start out with, I kind of liked what, Sam was alluding at in show prep, is that, we are just one of the primary battles of aesthetics or beauty today is this overarching idea of subjectivity and relativism that, what's beautiful to me or what I find as beauty doesn't matter what you find as beauty, as if there's no objectivity to it, that it's all just like a preference or a taste. And so, but we can argue about taste all day long and it can be ultimately meaningless. But when we're talking about beauty, there's something that really is objective, at least from my ignorant understanding to it. And so I guess my first question for you is something that I thought we would start out with a bang, and ask you one of those questions that I myself couldn't give an easy answer to if somebody asked me. And that is, what is beauty? And how would you define beauty?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And we often hear that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And of course, there is a truth to that, or that's part of the answer. So Thomas Aquinas talks about beauty as being that which is seen, or that which gives pleasure when seen. So that's a very kind of oversimplistic kind of definition. It needs to be teased out a bit. But what he's talking about is that basically when truth or goodness is perceived directly into our sense experience, that's when we experience beauty. And there's an objective component to it and a subjective one. So there's these objective qualities to beauty, like unity or integrity or wholeness. So something has to be one. Then there's another aspect of it that Aquinas talks about, which is proportionality or harmony or consonance. So we imagine that the human body has all these components that have that are in proportion to one another. So we have, if you have 5 fingers on one side, we have 5 on the other. There's this harmony between balance between the different parts. And then when these things are in accord with one another, there's a clarity or a radiance that radiates forth from the form itself. And this is where the subjective component comes in, because when we experience that radiance, that's when that's something that is personal to us. So we have the objective part, which is the unity, this proportionality, and then the subjective component is us receiving that into our senses.
No, I think that's great.
Yeah, that's really incredible. My wife and I were just recently at an art museum, which a lot of times is a mixed bag these days. And of course, there was the modern art section where there was just clashing colors, kind of random shapes. Nothing really fit together. It was kind of the opposite of what you're describing. It wasn't proportionate. It wasn't harmonious. It wasn't balanced. It was chaotic. And the way, the modern art is approached is often as like an intellectual exercise exclusively, where it's like, if you have a complicated enough intellectual justification for what you're doing, you can get away with almost anything, like putting a hammer on a table is like some philosophical statement or something, or, so, but what you're describing is like an intuitive response.
Yes.
Like, a child can go up and look at like a Picasso or a Rembrandt and immediately tell, without any art education whatsoever, which is more beautiful. And in fact, I remember our kids saying something like, "That's really ugly," when they saw the modern art. Like, they had no art training whatsoever. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, like, what in us is responding to this objective beauty? Like, what is kind of saying yes when we see that beauty, that proportionality, that harmony, all of these things? Like, what are we responding to, I suppose?
Well, I think it's an intuitive perception of this unity and harmony, which is basically what we can understand as order. Okay, so when we look up at the stars, for instance, and we see we experience this overarching awe. Part of that is the feeling of sublimity, like we're small in front of this amazing universe, but also there's an understanding of order there as well, that we're a part of this cosmos that is so intricately put together by an intelligent being, that God created the world in all these harmonies. And when we perceive that order, that's when we intuitively have that response. But it also has to hit us in kind of a new way. When we get too redundant, everyone gets, we have to strive towards not getting bogged down by repetition. So I think that there's an aspect there. And then there's another aspect of we need to strive to how do I say? We can't allow beauty to become rote, I would say.
And so on that line of thought, what do you do in your own personal studio as a creator to, I guess, nurture that within yourself and keep that opportunity alive and keep that truth alive within you? Because it is very much this balance between, what is good is also beautiful, right? If we believe that it's a unified transcendental in God, and what is truthful is also beautiful. But I guess to that aspect, how do you keep from falling into it being rote or being, repetitive and maybe contrived, if you will?
Right. Yeah. I think one way is I'm always looking towards nature. I always look towards nature to draw in new inspiration. So art in particular, the way Aristotle talks about art is that art imitates nature. It's mimesis. Okay, now that doesn't necessarily rote copying of nature. It means that whatever the artist is creating has to be within. It has to be believable. It has to suspend your disbelief within the world. So I'm always looking towards nature, and but I'm also I also look towards the great master. So I'm always looking up. How has someone done this subject in the past? How can I incorporate that into my in my own interpretation of things, and then how can I reshape that and modify it to something that's personal to me and hopefully affects people today. So I'm always looking to the old masters, and then also just trying to do something that that I've never seen before, that has my own personal take on it.
I love that idea about art imitating nature. One of my favorite architects, Frank Lloyd Wright, was always talking about that. But the interesting thing about nature is it's like this perfect tension between order and chaos, or like it's not perfectly symmetrical. If you look at a tree, it's not perfectly symmetrical. There's variety there, and there's a little bit of chaos, but it's obviously being held in tension with like a beautiful form that you can find mathematical patterns all over nature. So I'm wondering for you, like, when did you start waking up to some of these things? Like, when did you start realizing some of this and felt like, I guess, a call to be like, I want to be a creator of beauty, not just not just someone receiving it, but someone who's actually producing it and bringing more beauty into the world?
Yeah. So I grew up in Chicago originally, and in a neighborhood where within probably a 3-mile radius, there was 4 or 5 churches that were just absolutely gorgeous, created by, immigrants from the 19th century, early 20th century. So these churches are about 100 years old, beautiful statues, stained glass window, paintings that are just, drawn from the old masters and then reproduced there in the church. So basically my first exposure to art was going to mass and going to church, and I just look around and it was really there where I started to get this inkling of how important art was, and the importance of how it submerges you into salvation history. I remember one of the things I talk about is this. There's a stained glass window that I used to see all the time in this church, and it was Noah's Ark. And even as a little kid, I'd be like, why did God allow for the flood? To have all these people killed, and you're just confronted with that, but not in a didactic or in a teaching way, but just immersed in the art. And on the opposite side of that window, facing it, was a sign of the new covenant, Christ ascending into heaven, and the Last Supper right there. So it's drawing a connection from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and how our salvation is achieved through Jesus Christ. So that's basically how I started getting the inkling for like, okay, art is, this stuff is really kind of important. And what I started to see was that I'd go out to the suburbs of Chicago and just see these like completely modernist churches with no art. They don't look like churches. You can't find the tabernacle. The stained glass is ugly, geometric. There's no figurative elements to it other than maybe a crucifix, which may or may not be, disfigured. And basically I got to the point in college where I started looking around. I'm like, well, I don't know if I could do this, but I certainly feel like I can do a better job than what's out there now. And so like that was basically it, like a process of elimination. Like I may not be as good as a Rembrandt or some of these masters, but I certainly feel like I can do a little bit better than what's being done right now.
Yeah. No, I think that's really what a journey. That's so exciting, and it parallels a lot, I think, of most artists, right, and most musicians. And when I was first discerning becoming a professional trumpet player, I found myself learning from the masters, as you kind of alluded to and said earlier, and I started discerning, well, it's so powerful and so impactful. I want to be a part of that. I want to, produce and not just consume that. And so I think to that point, you already mentioned it with stained glass windows that were a teaching tool for you and in your childhood. And we see that so much of that has been removed or stripped from our modern churches today. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, about what can beauty within the church do for the salvation of souls, for the faithful. And once it's been, stripped away, how is it adding to, I guess, losing Catholics, which I believe it is. And so I just, full disclosure, I think that's why bad choirs cause people to leave and not want to come back to that church, because it's all a sign of God's truth, goodness, and beauty. And if it is an amateur that's there, it, and it speaks to you in a way that we don't want to speak to people. So I'd love to hear what you're doing and what your thoughts are on the importance of beauty within the church.
Yeah, well, I think it's so important, and and oftentimes it's the neglected transcendental. There's a great quote I found on Irvine Balthazar. He says, "Our situation today shows that beauty demands for itself at least as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness, and she will not allow herself to be separated and banned from her two sisters without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance.
Ooh,
we can be
good.
Who sneers at her name, as if she were the ornament of a bourgeois past, whether he admits it or not, can no longer pray and soon will no longer be able to love."
Wow.
So what I think he's saying there is that that truth, goodness, and beauty have to go along with one another. Otherwise, it's like a tripod. One of the legs goes, the tripod is going to fall. And what we're seeing today is this vengeance of beauty, or a lack of it there, I would say. And it's not, of course, there are beautiful churches in Europe being completely abandoned, turned into concert halls, being used as event places. So it's not the only thing that's going to keep people there. Those places are lacking the truth of the gospel. So we see that one of these without the other can't survive. But it is so important, especially here, I think in the United States, where we have so many churches and just kind of, just almost like that they're places that are meeting places, considered like almost in a practical manner, or rather than the house of God, the throne of God, where God meets man. Like you can't possibly consider any more important place here existing on earth. And we just think, oh, you know what? As long as it's functional, it'll be fine. And to that point, I think that there's a great it does a great disservice to the liturgy as well, when we don't have architecture or even the fine arts, especially music as well, that orients one towards the reality that is present in the liturgy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the utilitarianism that kind of defines the modern age, it's like, you think of like the Bauhaus movement in the 60s and things like that, where it's like function was everything and all ornamentation was completely stripped away and removed. And what's ironic about that is that's kind of what animals do. Like, I mean, an ape can crack a nut with a rock. Like that's that's very utilitarian. But it's
Right.
only human beings decorate their tools, and ornament them because there's something else there that's being perceived. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, like, we've kind of degenerated from all ornamentation into like strict utilitarianism, but now you're part of a movement to bring beauty and ornament back, but it's part of this great tradition of artists. Like, what are you doing to kind of not just copycat previous artists, because I know you're not doing that, but like you're trying to inject, your own originality and like creativity and like and in a sense a kind of newness while being rooted in tradition. And so how are you doing that? Like, how are you, when you undertake a new project, a new commission, like how do you balance that tension between old and new, and not swing too far one way or the other?
Yeah. Well, I would say that I try to immerse myself in the masters, so I'm always researching, and that kind of connects me with the tradition. And I also have my background is in classical painting, so I went through a very rigorous process of honing my craft, and I would say that immersed me into this tradition that started from, about the Renaissance all the way up through the 19th century. So what I was doing there was I was drawing from the figure at the school every day, and I was doing master copies. I was drawing from casts. And so, which are, plastic or plaster models of great sculptures. And we would draw these out. So I did that. I was basically drawing for like 2 years straight. I didn't even touch a paintbrush, immersing myself in art history and this whole great tradition. And then I started painting. So that kind of rooted me in this tradition. And what I see my role as today is just, I'm a contemporary person. I grew up on, like indie rock and, and, just, all sorts of contemporary stuff, the contemporary issues that we have today. So I don't necessarily see myself as having to do anything new other than just be, just think the way I'm thinking, which is like, I'm a contemporary guy, I'm going to come up with ideas that are different from those in the past, just because I have a different perspective on things, just because of our time period,
Yeah, but it doesn't make it any less valid, and I think that's really important, because you're still standing on the shoulders of your masters, or of the masters, right? You talked about going to be classically trained and to make sure that you really understood that. And I promise I'm going to put it in the show notes. Everyone needs to check out some of your paintings, and you can see over your shoulder there one of them. I want you to talk because of what you were saying about spending 2 years just sketching. I remember me as a trumpet player, and I won't ever forget this. I was on a full ride at my undergrad, and it was my junior year in my undergrad degree, and I was playing for one of the best trumpet teachers in the world. And I played this incredibly difficult trumpet solo, and I finished it, and I nailed it, and it was perfect, and it was like mic drop moment. And she looked at me and she was like, wow, that was perfect. And I was like, yes, it was, that pride was on me. But I was disassociated from the aesthetics. I was disassociated from the beauty. And she said, did you enjoy anything that you just played? And I was like, what? And I mean, I was seeing myself as it was this math problem. I was still this pursuit of perfection without this sort of overarching beauty. When did that hit you? When did you expand beyond just sketching for 2 years straight to like really being able to create these gorgeous masterpieces that you're doing? Did you have moments like that along your journey? I'd love to hear about those.
Well, I think it's interesting because there's such a need for. I'm going to answer that indirectly because I want to start with craftsmanship, because I see two major problems with Catholic art today. One is that we don't have good craftsmanship, and this is simply the language of visual art. You are a musician. You had to learn the scales. I bet you had to play those scales a lot. And all of a sudden, and apparently just for the visual arts, we're like, you know what? We don't need to do that stuff anymore. You don't need to draw things from nature. You don't need to do value scales. You don't need to learn about color. You just need to express yourself. Well, yeah, okay. I mean, that's fine if you want to create a punk rock band, but it's not going to get you Beethoven, And in that respect, that's something that I see severely lacking in several of very, very well-intentioned Catholic artists today. They have such a love for God and even a deep knowledge of theology and art, and yet they just haven't had the training to learn some of the rudimentary things about the craftsmanship. The second issue that I see is a lack of depth in the once you've mastered a craft, you can rely too much on old forms or just the exercises, and so it's like, so you have this tendency to be like, okay, I'm gonna do exactly what they did in the past. Or if you've studied at a school of realism, you may look at something and just be like, I'm gonna paint that exactly what I see. Well, I mean, sorry, but sacred art and religious art is not meant to be totally just an imitation of nature. It needs ideals grafted onto that. And you need to idealize both the figure and the space in order to elevate it beyond just the natural world. So there's this, I think for myself, like to get back to your question, I think for myself, there's always been this tension of trying to continue to master the craft and also draw from the old masters. And then, but I'm always trying to push myself a little bit further in terms of, well, what's something that I haven't, and I don't ask this question like, because I don't think novelty is important in the sense that I'm not looking to shock people. I'm just going to create something new. No, that's not my goal. Well, my goal is to be authentic to myself and ultimately to my ideals and to God. I'm going to let God try to inform my inspirations, and that's going to create something new. But there is that tension of drawing in from the tradition and then really doing my due diligence to actually be creative. It's hard work being creative. Yeah. It takes a lot of work. You have to put time into actually thinking about something. You have to read stuff. You have to do the studies, like a bunch of different, like studies of the figure in different positions. You gotta do all this stuff. And if you don't do that stuff, then ultimately it's going to end up being a painting or a piece that's just derivative.
Yeah. Wow. No, I really just agree with everything you stated, and I appreciate you sharing it in such a manner. And I appreciate you going back to the importance of technique as a lasting, kind of imprint in this for any artists that are listening, to this episode. So anyways, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about like this harmonious interplay between like objectivity and subjectivity. It's like if it's strictly objectivity, you're a machine. If you're all subjectivity, you're not rooted in reality anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like they have to be united at some level or things break down. But that kind of leads me to the next question I have, which is just, let's say you're on the receiving end. People have kind of lost their taste or their ability to some extent just because of the kind of brutal, cold, sterile world we live in, surrounded by, concrete boxes. Or it's like it's harder for us to recognize beauty. It's not as instinctive as it might have been at one point when the world was kind of immersed and everything was beautiful at some level. And now we're like, how do we develop that taste for beauty, like on the receiving end of beautiful art? Like, how can we learn to contemplate beauty and allow beauty to kind of take us out of this ordinary mode of existence that we live most of our lives in and take us into kind of a different level of seeing and perceiving? Like, what are some ways we can train ourselves in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because it draws our focus back to our experience today. And where I think this is actually where the battlefront is in our culture is actually, we have truth. We have tons of people talking about the truth. We have tons of people talking, tons of charities to give to, all that. There's tons of good things happening, but where is the battle of the culture being fought? It's being fought in the imagination. And the reason why I say that is because we live in such an artificial world, where you can be on your smartphone, all your friends are virtual. You can be completely immersed in social media. The majority of people are spending a ridiculous amount of time on media. Not saying this, this podcast is a bad thing to be doing. But what I think is going on there is that we can't even recognize reality from virtual reality, artificial from real. Yeah. So we need to first start to make distinctions between reality and unreality, something that's constructed. So I think the best place for people to start is just go back to nature, like take walks. Go to a state park, go to a national park. Try to find time in your day to go for a walk outside. Do activities outside, hunting, running, camping. It's an important part of my day to like go for a run, fairly often throughout the week. And part of that is the exercise. The other part is just like, I'm not like stuck in my studio all day. I'm not, I'm not just like stuck on the computer all day. So I think that's a good place to start. The other thing that I think we need to cultivate is we need to start cultivating our taste, because although beauty is intuitive, that doesn't necessarily mean it's instinctive. It's something that's taught. So there's a teaching element there too, that if you're bombarding yourself with ugly things, eventually you're going to have a distaste for beautiful things. It's just like if you're feeding yourself lies all the time, or if you go to a college that indoctrinates you into some sort of, ideology. pretty soon that person is just not going to be able to be receptive to the truth. And it's the same thing with beauty. So are the shows we're watching, are they beautiful? And I don't mean like that everything has to be, aesthetically perfect. What I'm talking about is making an effort to use your leisure time to do something a little bit challenging, which is, find a piece of art, read a good book instead of, just the latest, trashy novel, avoid things that are going to scar your imagination, like pornography or just like mindless entertainment. All these things they literally create pathways into our mind. I mean, like, I can't tell you about how many times like something I saw when I was like 7 years old still pops up into my head. Like, I don't want that, but that's what we're doing is we're creating these pathways of where all we can think of is things that are just either don't need to be there or they're ugly. And we need to start replacing that with beautiful things, beautiful objects, looking at art, which should elevate the mind, listening to good music, listening to, or reading challenging literature. I think even like, especially certain movies that are just so uplifting or rather than just the purely entertaining ones. These are ways that I think once we start actually fighting, this culture of ugliness within ourselves, we're going to be disposed to greater beauty. It is like a muscle, you have to exercise it. And I don't always do a good job of that. Like sometimes when it's the choice between watching a ridiculous Arnold Schwarzenegger movie or like, the edifying like art house movie that's been on my list for like a year. I'm like, no, I'm just going to watch the action movie. And then afterwards, I'm kind of like, well, I don't even remember what happened because it was so banal and stupid that I didn't even need to do that. So, but yeah, I think more recently I've been really cutting down on media. And honestly, that's freed up a lot of time to read. And also, go for walks and look at art. So
No, I think that's so great. And what I'm hearing is that we have to require ourselves to experience it, right? We have to put ourselves in those situations that we can experience beauty on all level of the senses, not just visually, but you mentioned, through listening and even feeling to a degree, going on walks and things like that. I think that's so important. And so, this idea of the way of beauty, right? The via pulchritudinis that we're hearing about in the church as a primary tool of evangelization today, which is what Stabat Mater is attempting to do. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that for my last question. Let our listeners know where it is they can find out more about you and what you are doing with your organization and how they can stay connected, and then how that's going to help them better appreciate beauty so that they themselves can give what they've gained and utilize this transcendental to evangelize the culture. I'd love to hear you speak on that.
Thanks so much. So I think another aspect of that, starting to incorporate, beauty into your life. Part of that is just getting good artwork in your house, and getting images of the saints and Mary and Jesus. This disposes us to having constant conversation with our Lord and Mary. And then the other thing that you can do is connect with an artist. I mean, artists speak in a language that we kind of feel like we can relate to. but we couldn't do ourselves. And so, and so allow that artist to be your voice, to explore things that you could never put into an image or music or something like that. And that's really what we're trying to offer people at the Stabat Mater Foundation. So all of the work that I've done for the past 5 years, what would not be possible without the Stabat Mater Foundation, which has given me basically a fellowship. And at the foundation, we believe that new great art can be made, is being made, and it has the power to transform our culture into one of life and beauty. And it also believes in the visionaries who are the artists making that art today. And we do that in 3 primary ways. We donate heavily or subsidize commission artwork for Catholic churches and Catholic institutions so that we can make beautiful original sacred art available to communities who may not have been able to afford it. That's what we've done here in Tyler, Texas, where I'm at. The foundation, I've worked in a bunch of different churches here now because of the foundation. The diocese wasn't gonna, it's not on their mind to commission an artist for, another painting. So the foundation, they were eager to get the artwork, but it wasn't the first thing on their mind. We also provide free or inexpensive, high quality classical art workshops, summer camps, and after school programs. So I have a full-time apprentice right now who's going through a very similar training that I'm going through. And we'd love to get more people who are interested in the arts coming on board. I'd love to train people. Some more people who are passionate about the arts. And finally, we give educational talks, events, and to help better form the faithful, our clergy, and the general public about sacred art tradition. Finally, what they've offered me and what I am is the Stabat Mater Art Fellow. And what that does is it basically operates like patronage, like the art patrons of old, which is so cool. And it basically gave me a stable income so that I could spend the time actually taking the time to do the artwork to do. That it takes a long time to do a painting.
Yeah, for sure. A good one.
And they've allowed me to have a stable income to do that. And so if we get more donors, then we can bring on another artist. We can patronize another artist who's, may not make it, and help them out. So we don't think anyone else is patronizing the arts in this way. And so I think it's so unique and desperately needed. And I'm saying that from a very personal perspective. Like I was at the point where I might have given up if I didn't have that. So we're a non-for-profit. We're headquartered on this beautiful farm, Stafford's Meadow Farm in the piney woods of East Texas. And anyone is welcome to come out and visit if they'd like.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Robert, I really appreciate that. We're going to put all that in the show notes, and we're going to have you back on. There's a lot more questions on beauty and evangelizing through beauty that we didn't get to in this episode. So I really appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for giving of yourself, and thanks for all your beautiful artwork. We'll be sure to put a lot of those links in the show notes.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Well, as we like to end each of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.